The open sea has always held a dual nature in the human imagination, a vast expanse of both boundless opportunity and profound, isolating danger. It is a place of trade, of discovery, of the promise of new lands and unimaginable riches. But in the shadowed troughs between waves, in the secluded coves of forgotten islands, and just over the horizon, another, more predatory aspect of the sea has always lingered. This is the realm of the pirate, a figure of terror and, paradoxically, of romantic fascination, a symbol of rebellion and brutal freedom, whose black flag has cast a long shadow across the entirety of human history. The story of piracy is not a simple tale of treasure chests and talking parrots. It is a sprawling, global epic of desperation, greed, and survival, a reflection of the empires that rose and fell on the tides of trade and war. It's a story we are going to explore in full. And as we raise the main sail on this journey, we'd love for you to comment with where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. And be sure to subscribe so you're notified when we release future stories. The tale begins not in the sun-drenched Caribbean of popular fiction, but in the mists of antiquity, when the first mariners pushed their primitive vessels from the shore and realized that the cargo of another ship was far easier to acquire than the fruits of their own labor. From the mysterious sea peoples who brought mighty empires to their knees in the Bronze Age, to the Cilician marauders who once held a young Julius Caesar for ransom, piracy has been an enduring feature of civilization, an illicit trade that flourished in the spaces between power and law. It's a history that unfolds across every ocean, driven by the winds of change and the currents of human ambition, a testament to the enduring and often violent struggle for control of the world's great blue highways. Our story's true beginning takes root in the dying light of a magnificent age, a time nearly 3,000 years before the dawn of the Golden Age of Caribbean piracy. In the late Bronze Age, the Eastern Mediterranean was a nexus of civilization, a vibrant network of powerful empires intricately connected by the sea. The Hittites forged iron and commanded legions of chariots in Anatolia. The Mycenaean Greeks built Cyclopean fortresses and sailed in search of glory and trade. And on the banks of the Nile, the new kingdom of Egypt stood as a colossus of gold and divine authority. For centuries, their ships had plied the turquoise waters, carrying precious cargoes of copper ingots from Cyprus, fine pottery, wine, and olive oil, weaving a complex tapestry of international commerce. But this intricate world of palaces and trade routes was about to be consumed by a tide of fire and violence, brought to their shores by a mysterious and terrifying confederation of maritime raiders, known to history only by the name their victims gave them: the Sea Peoples. Their origin remains one of history's great unsolved puzzles, a ghostly question mark on the map of the ancient world. They were not a single nation, but a coalition of different seafaring tribes, a ferocious alliance that exploded out of the Aegean or the Western Mediterranean with a singular, devastating purpose. The Egyptians, who chronicled the invasion on the towering walls of the Medinet Habu temple, described them with palpable fear. Inscriptions carved for Pharaoh Ramesses III declare, "The foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms." They came in fleets of distinctive, high-prowed ships, their warriors armed with bronze swords, round shields, and horned helmets. They did not merely raid, they annihilated. Great cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to smoldering rubble. The mighty Hittite capital of Hattusa was burned to the ground, its empire vanishing from history forever. The bustling port city of Ugarit on the Syrian coast, a vital hub of trade, sent a final, desperate letter pleading for help before its own destruction. A clay tablet baked hard in the very fire that consumed it. The Sea Peoples swept down the Levantine coast, leaving a trail of desolation that stretched for hundreds of kilometers, well over 100 miles, before they finally set their sights on the ultimate prize, the inexhaustible wealth of Egypt. They came by land and by sea, a coordinated invasion to break the last great power of the Bronze Age. But Ramesses III was ready. He met their fleet in a cataclysmic battle in the Nile Delta, using a clever strategy to trap their ships in the river's channels, where their seafaring skills were neutralized by the grappling hooks and devastating volleys of the Egyptian archers. The Nile ran red with their blood, and the invasion was broken. But the victory was a hollow one. The world the Egyptians had known was gone, shattered into fragments. The Bronze Age collapse, a period of widespread societal breakdown, and a dark age that descended upon the Mediterranean, was in no small part authored by these first great pirates, who proved that even the mightiest empires could be brought to their knees by a determined force from the sea. As the dust settled and new civilizations slowly clawed their way from the wreckage, the nature of piracy began to change. For the ancient Greeks who rose in the centuries following the collapse, seafaring was a way of life, and the line between a merchant, a warrior, and a pirate was often blurred to the point of being non-existent. The Aegean Sea, a brilliant blue expanse dotted with over 2,000 islands, was a pirate's paradise. Its geography, with a coastline so indented it measures over 7,500 kilometers, nearly 4,700 miles, offered an almost infinite number of secluded bays, hidden coves, and natural harbors from which to launch surprise attacks. In the heroic age described by the poet Homer, raiding was not a crime, but a mark of prowess. In the Odyssey, its hero Odysseus, upon returning home, casually boasts of his exploits, telling a tale of how he and his men sacked the city of Ismarus, killing the men and taking the women, and plunder for themselves. It was seen as a legitimate, if dangerous, profession, a way for ambitious men to acquire wealth and status. The Greek word for pirate, pirates, simply meant one who attacks, and another term, leistes, was often used interchangeably for a plunderer or a soldier. Thucydides, the great historian of the Peloponnesian War, noted that in earlier times, Greeks would openly ask mariners if they were pirates, without any sense of insult being intended or taken. Piracy was simply a part of the maritime economy. But as Greek city-states like Athens and Corinth grew into commercial superpowers, their perspective shifted dramatically. Their prosperity now depended on the safe passage of grain ships from the Black Sea and merchant vessels from across the Mediterranean. The independent raiders who lurked amongst the Cyclades Islands were no longer romantic adventurers, but a direct threat to the economic lifeblood of the state. Athens, in its golden age, used its mighty navy, the most powerful in the world at the time, to suppress piracy and create the Delian League, a military alliance that, in part, functioned as the world's first organized anti-piracy patrol, ensuring that the sea lanes remained open for business. Yet even with this naval might, piracy was never fully eradicated. It simply retreated to the fringes, waiting for the power of the great city-states to wane. When it did, and as the Roman Republic began to extend its influence across the Mediterranean, piracy returned with a vengeance, reaching a scale and level of organization previously unimaginable. The most formidable of these new sea lords were the Cilician pirates. Hailing from the rugged coastal region of Cilicia in southern Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, they were not a disorganized rabble, but a veritable maritime nation unto themselves. Exploiting the power vacuum left by the declining Seleucid Empire, they built a network of fortresses and naval bases that gave them control over the eastern sea lanes. They sailed in organized squadrons of light, fast vessels like the Lembus and the Hemiolia, perfectly designed for ambush and pursuit. At their peak, they were said to command over 1,000 ships and had captured 400 cities. Their primary business was not treasure, but people. The insatiable demand for slaves in the sprawling estates and mines of the Roman Republic created a market of monstrous proportions, and the Cilicians were its main suppliers. They captured travelers, raided coastal towns, and sold their human cargo at massive slave markets, most notably on the island of Delos, which was said to be capable of handling 10,000 slaves in a single day. Their power became so absolute that they sailed with impunity, their banners of black and red striking fear into merchants and travelers alike. They disrupted Rome's vital grain supply from Egypt and Sicily, causing food shortages and public unrest in the capital itself. It was during this reign of terror, in the year 75 BCE, that the Cilicians made their most famous and, in retrospect, most fateful capture. A 25-year-old Roman nobleman named Gaius Julius Caesar was sailing to Rhodes to study oratory under the famed teacher Apollonius. Off the coast of Asia Minor, his vessel was overtaken by a swift pirate galley. Dragged aboard, the young Caesar showed none of the terror his captors expected. When the pirates demanded a ransom of 20 talents of silver, a massive sum equivalent to about 600,000 denarii, or a modern weight of over 500 kilograms, roughly 1,200 pounds of silver, Caesar is said to have laughed in their faces. He told them they clearly didn't know who they had captured and insisted that his ransom be raised to 50 talents, a truly staggering fortune. For 38 days, he was held captive on a small island, yet he behaved not as a prisoner, but as a commander. He treated the pirates as his personal bodyguards, shushing them when they were too loud for his liking, and ordering them to listen to the speeches and poems he composed in his spare time. He joined in their games and exercises, all the while jokingly, but with a chilling undertone, telling them that once he was free, he would hunt them all down and have them crucified. The pirates, amused by his audacity, took it as a joke. They had no idea of the ruthless ambition and iron will that burned within their captive. Once the 50 talents arrived and Caesar was released, he did not waste a moment. He immediately went to the port of Miletus, raised a private fleet of ships, and set sail for the pirate stronghold. He caught his former captors completely by surprise, capturing most of them and their newfound riches. He then took them to Pergamum and made a request to the provincial governor to have them executed. When the governor, an indecisive man, hesitated and suggested selling them as slaves, Caesar took matters into his own hands. Acting on his own authority, he marched to the prison and, making good on his promise, had every one of them crucified. as a small act of clemency for their oddly respectful treatment of him, he ordered their throats to be slit first, to spare them the prolonged agony of death on the cross. The incident became a legend, a stark illustration of Caesar's character. But the larger problem of the Cilicians remained. They were strangling the Republic. Finally, in 67 BCE, the Roman Senate, pushed to the brink by the threat of famine, passed the Lex Gabinia. This radical law granted enormous, unprecedented power to one man, the brilliant general Pompey the Great, giving him supreme command over the entire Mediterranean Sea and its coastlines for 50 miles, or about 80 kilometers, inland. He was given more ships, soldiers, and money than any Roman commander before him. Pompey's campaign was a masterpiece of logistics and strategy. He divided the whole of the Mediterranean into 13 districts, assigning a fleet and a commander to each one. He then initiated a massive, synchronized sweep, driving the pirate forces systematically eastward, cornering them, and destroying their fleets as he went. The campaign was a stunning success. In a mere 40 days, he had cleared the western Mediterranean. He then converged all his forces on their homeland of Cilicia. Rather than fighting to the last man, many of the pirates, hearing of Pompey's surprisingly lenient terms for those who surrendered, simply gave up. In less than 3 months, a menace that had plagued the sea for decades was utterly crushed. The pirates were defeated, their fortresses dismantled, and an estimated 20,000 former raiders were resettled inland as farmers, a pragmatic solution to prevent them from simply returning to their old ways. Pompey's victory ushered in an era of Roman domination over the sea, which they would come to call Mare Nostrum, our sea. For a time, the black flag all but vanished, and the waters were made safe by the overwhelming force of a centralized, organized empire that could not tolerate such a brazen challenge to its authority. As the colossal structure of the Roman Empire fractured and crumbled, the Mediterranean, their Mare Nostrum, once a symbol of unified power, shattered into a mosaic of competing territories. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace that had for centuries suppressed piracy with the unyielding force of its legions and fleets, evaporated like sea spray on hot stone. The seas once again became wild, lawless frontiers, but the next great wave of seaborne terror would not rise from the warm southern waters. It would emerge from the cold, misty fjords of the far north, from a land of ice and fire, and it would arrive in a vessel that would become the single most terrifying and iconic symbol of its age, the Viking Longship. For the people of Scandinavia in the late 8th century, Life was a constant struggle against the unforgiving elements. It was a world of long, brutal winters where the sun was a fleeting visitor, and short, frantic summers of back-breaking farm work on small pockets of arable land. In this harsh environment, a culture was forged that prized strength, courage, and above all, a fierce and unyielding desire for honor and reputation, a legacy that would outlive death itself. For a young Norseman with no land to inherit and few prospects at home, the path to wealth and fame lay not in the soil, but across the sea. The ocean was their road, their escape, and their greatest opportunity. And in the Longship, they had perfected the ultimate tool for mastering it. The Viking Longship was a masterpiece of naval engineering, a sublime fusion of form and function that gave its crews an unparalleled advantage. Clinker-built, with overlapping oak planks fastened by iron rivets, its hull was both immensely strong and remarkably flexible, allowing it to bend and twist with the waves of the open Atlantic rather than shattering against them. A typical warship, a skeed, could be over 23 meters, or 75 feet, long, yet its revolutionary shallow draft meant it sat high in the water, displacing very little and requiring a depth of less than a meter, only about 3 feet, to float. This single design feature was the key to their devastating success. It allowed them to not only traverse the most violent ocean storms, but also to navigate far up shallow rivers, deep into the heart of unsuspecting lands, hundreds of kilometers from the coast. Powered by a single large square sail for long voyages and propelled by rows of oarsmen for lightning-fast assaults, the Longship was a weapon of terrifying versatility. And at its prow, the carved, snarling head of a dragon or a serpent was designed to strike primal fear into the hearts of their enemies. A fearsome beast emerging from the morning mist to vomit forth a torrent of screaming, axe-wielding warriors. The dawn of this new age of piracy can be dated to a specific day, the 8th of June, 793 AD. On the holy island of Lindisfarne, a lonely finger of land extending from the coast of Northumbria in northeastern England. A small community of monks lived a quiet life of prayer and contemplation. Their monastery was a beacon of Christian learning in the Anglo-Saxon world, renowned for its beautifully illuminated manuscripts and its collection of sacred relics. It was a place of profound peace, and it was completely undefended. It was, to the pagan Norsemen who had crossed the unforgiving North Sea, the perfect target. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a contemporary record of the time, described the event with apocalyptic horror. Here, terrible portents came about over the land of Northumbria and miserably frightened the people. These were immense flashes of lightning, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the air. A great famine soon followed these signs, and a little after that, in the same year, the ravaging of wretched heathen men destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne through brutal robbery and slaughter. The monks, who may have mistaken the approaching longships for simple merchant vessels, were caught utterly by surprise. The Vikings stormed the shore with a ferocity the monks could not comprehend. They plundered the golden chalices, the jewel-encrusted crosses, and the silver reliquaries. They slaughtered those who stood in their way, set fire to the hallowed buildings, and dragged other monks away in chains, destined to be sold as slaves. To the Christian kingdoms of Europe, this was not merely a raid. It was a profound sacrilege, an attack on God himself. The scholar Alcuin of York wrote in a letter to the King of Northumbria, "Never before has such a terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God, like dung in the streets." The raid on Lindisfarne was a shockwave that reverberated across the continent, announcing the arrival of a new and terrible force upon the seas. It was the beginning of 2 centuries of fear, a period that would forever be known as the Viking Age. The Vikings were masters of what they called strandhug, or shore hewing. Their tactics were built on speed, surprise, and the ruthless exploitation of their enemies' weaknesses. They would appear without warning, their longships allowing them to strike at dawn and be gone long before any local military force could be mustered to respond. They were not an army of conquest in these early years, but pirates and raiders on a grand scale, targeting the most vulnerable and richest locations, monasteries, coastal villages, and trading towns. Their reach was staggering, and their impact transformative. To the west, they descended upon Ireland, its green shores and multitude of monasteries offering irresistible plunder. They sailed up the rivers Liffey, Shannon, and Boyne, establishing fortified coastal camps known as long forts, one of which would eventually grow into the city of Dublin. From Ireland, they pushed further into the unknown, using their incredible seafaring skills to cross the open Atlantic. They colonized Iceland, a desolate volcanic island, and from there, a Norseman named Eric the Red, exiled for manslaughter, led a party of settlers to an even more remote land he deceptively named Greenland. It was his son, Leif Erikson, who around the year 1000, a full 5 centuries before Christopher Columbus, would sail even further west, making landfall on the coast of what is now Newfoundland in Canada. He called it Vinland, the land of wine, after the wild grapes his crew found there. Though their small settlement was ultimately abandoned after a few years of conflict with the native inhabitants they called Skrylings. They were the first Europeans to set foot in the Americas, a testament to their unparalleled spirit of exploration, a spirit inextricably linked to their raiding culture. Simultaneously, other Norsemen turned their dragon prows to the east and south, fundamentally reshaping the map of Europe. Those from Sweden, known as the Varangians, journeyed across the Baltic Sea and into the vast, dense forests of what would become Russia. They dragged their longships overland between vast river systems, navigating the Dnieper down to the Black Sea and the Volga to the Caspian. They were both raiders and traders, exchanging furs, honey, wax, and slaves for the silver and silks of the Byzantine Empire and the Abbasid Caliphate. So formidable was their reputation as warriors that the Byzantine emperor recruited them to serve as his personal elite bodyguard, the legendary Varangian Guard, who were famed for their loyalty, their ferocity, and their massive two-handed battle axes. Their presence was so profound that they became the ruling class among the Slavic tribes, and the very name Russia is believed to derive from the Rus, the name the local peoples gave to these Norse newcomers. Meanwhile, Danish and Norwegian Vikings sailed south to terrorize the powerful and wealthy Carolingian Empire. They sailed up the Seine, the Loire, and the Garonne, sacking cities as far inland as Paris, which they besieged in 845 AD with a fleet of over 100 ships, forcing the Frankish king, Charles the Bald, to pay them a bribe of 7,000 pounds of silver, nearly 3,000 kilograms, to leave. This protection money, known as Danegeld, became a common and cripplingly expensive policy for many European rulers. They rounded the Iberian Peninsula, clashing with the sophisticated armies of the Moorish caliphates in Spain and Portugal, and even pushed into the Mediterranean, the old Roman lake, raiding the coasts of Italy and North Africa. In time, their strategy evolved. The hit-and-run raids gave way to large-scale invasions. Massive fleets, sometimes numbering hundreds of ships, landed great armies that no longer left after a season of plunder. In England, the Great Heathen Army arrived in 865, a coalition of Norse war bands that systematically conquered kingdom after kingdom, seeking not just plunder, but land. They established a permanent presence, a territory known as the Danelaw, and nearly extinguished the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms entirely before being checked by the heroic resistance of Alfred the Great. In France, the repeated invasions of Vikings, led by the chieftain Rollo, became so persistent that in 911, the Frankish King Charles the Simple offered him a deal. In exchange for peace and Rollo's conversion to Christianity, he would be granted a vast tract of land. Rollo agreed, and his domain became known as Normandy, the land of the Northmen. In a single generation, the pirates had become princes, and it was their descendants, the Normans, who would, in 1066, launch the last successful invasion of England. This process of assimilation and settlement signaled the beginning of the end for the Viking Age. The Christianization of Scandinavia slowly tempered the old warrior ethos. The chaotic world of petty chieftains gave way to powerful, centralized monarchies in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Kings who had little tolerance for independent pirate crews who might disrupt their own royal ambitions. And in the lands they had once terrorized, kingdoms like England and France had learned from their enemy. They built fleets, fortified their towns, and organized standing armies. The soft targets were gone. By the late 11th century, the age of the longship was fading. The Viking, the pirate who had defined an era, was being replaced by the knight, the crusader, and the king. Yet their legacy was indelible. They had been far more than simple robbers. They were explorers who had doubled the size of the known European world, traders who had forged new commercial networks across continents, and catalysts of political change whose raids had inadvertently forged nations and set in motion the creation of the modern map of Europe. They were the undisputed masters of the northern seas, a storm from the north that had forever changed the world it descended upon. While the dragon ships of the north were carving their fiery sagas across the coastlines of Europe, the sea that had birthed Western civilization was festering. The Mediterranean, no longer the placid lake of a single Roman master, had become a fractured and violent frontier, a liquid battleground between two of the world's great faiths, Christianity and Islam. For centuries, this was not a war of pitched battles and grand armies alone. It was a gritty, relentless, low-level conflict fought day by day, a war of ambush and abduction, of raid and reprisal. This was the age of the Corsair, a new breed of sea raider who sailed not just for plunder, but under the sacred banners of holy war. The stage for this bloody drama was the Barbary Coast, a stretch of North African shoreline that ran for nearly 1,600 kilometers, close to 1,000 miles, from modern-day Morocco to Libya. Its primary city-states, Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli, became the capitals of a maritime enterprise built on piracy. The corsairs who operated from these ports were not simple criminals in the eyes of their own people. They were privateers, sanctioned by their local rulers, the Deys and Beys, to wage a sea jihad against the Christian states of Europe. They saw themselves as holy warriors, the Ghazis, continuing the great struggle that had begun with the expulsion of the Moors from Spain during the Reconquista. Tens of thousands of these Muslim and Jewish refugees, driven from their homes in Andalusia, had settled along the Barbary coast, bringing with them not only their skills and knowledge, but also a burning, generational hatred for the Christian kingdoms that had dispossessed them. They turned to the sea for their revenge, and in doing so, they unleashed a reign of terror that would haunt the shipping lanes and coastal communities of Europe for over 300 years. The true architects of this new maritime power, the men who would elevate the Barbary Corsairs from a local nuisance to a strategic threat capable of challenging the great powers of Europe, were two brothers from the Greek island of Lesbos. They were Oruch and his younger brother, Huzur, sons of a potter who had converted to Islam. From a young age, they took to the sea, but their early careers were met with disaster. While serving on a merchant vessel, Oruch was captured by the Knights of St. John, the sworn Christian enemies of all Muslim seafarers. He spent several years chained to an oar as a galley slave, a brutal, soul-crushing existence that forged in him an iron will and an inextinguishable hatred for his captors. After a daring escape, he established himself as a corsair, his audacity and tactical genius quickly earning him a fearsome reputation. He was a striking figure, a powerful man with a fiery red beard that earned him the nickname Barbarossa, Italian for Redbeard. Operating from the Tunisian island of Djerba, he and his brother Huzur began a series of incredibly successful raids, capturing Christian ships laden with treasure, and more importantly, capturing the Christian crews to be sold in the lucrative slave markets of North Africa. Oruch Barbarossa was more than a pirate. He was a brilliant military strategist and a nation builder. In 1516, he achieved his masterstroke, intervening in a succession dispute in the city of Algiers and seizing it for himself, becoming its new sultan. He had transformed a pirate base into his own personal kingdom. His reign, however, was short-lived. In 1518, while fighting the Spanish, who were desperately trying to establish footholds in North Africa to contain the corsair threat, Oruch was cornered and killed. The mantle of leadership now fell upon his younger brother, Huzur, who would prove to be an even more formidable figure than his celebrated sibling. Huzur, who would inherit the name Barbarossa in honor of his brother, was a political visionary. He knew that his fledgling state of Algiers could not stand alone against the might of the Habsburg Empire, ruled by the powerful Emperor Charles V of Spain. And so, he made a decision that would change the balance of power in the Mediterranean. He sent an embassy to the most powerful Muslim ruler in the world, the Ottoman Sultan in Constantinople, Suleiman the Magnificent. Huzzur offered his allegiance and the city of Algiers to the Ottoman Empire. In exchange, he asked for military support and official recognition. Suleiman, a brilliant expansionist, immediately grasped the strategic value of having a permanent naval base in the Western Mediterranean from which to harass his Spanish rivals. He accepted the offer, sending soldiers and cannons to Algiers and bestowing upon Huzzur Barbarossa the honorary title of Beylerbey, or governor. More importantly, he was eventually named Kapudin Pasha, the Grand Admiral of the entire Ottoman fleet. In a single political maneuver, the Corsairs of Algiers had gone from being independent freebooters to becoming an officially sanctioned westernmost province of a global superpower. With the might of the Ottoman Empire at his back, Hayreddin Barbarossa, as he was now known, became the scourge of Christian Europe. He commanded vast fleets, devastated the coasts of Italy and Spain, and in 1538, at the Battle of Preveza, he utterly annihilated a much larger Holy League fleet assembled by the Pope, securing Ottoman naval dominance in the Mediterranean for decades to come. Facing this existential threat was a unique organization that was itself a product of the crusading era. The Knights of the Order of St. John of Jerusalem, originally founded in the 11th century as a hospital in the Holy Land to care for sick pilgrims. The order had evolved into a formidable military force, a brotherhood of aristocratic warrior monks drawn from the noble families of Europe. They were the shock troops of Christendom, bound by vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and a fourth, more vital vow, to defend the faith against the infidel. When the last Crusader strongholds in the Holy Land fell, the knights had staged a fighting retreat, first to Cyprus, and then, in 1310, they had conquered the island of Rhodes, which they transformed into a virtually impregnable fortress. For over 200 years, Rhodes was a Christian dagger pointed at the heart of the Muslim Levant, and from its harbor, the knights waged their own holy war at sea. They were the Christian Corsairs, preying on Muslim shipping, raiding Ottoman coastlines, and selling their Muslim captives into slavery with the same ruthless efficiency as their Barbary counterparts. This was a war of mirrors, where each side justified its piracy and slave raiding as a sacred duty. To the knights, Barbarossa was a pirate and a heretic. To Barbarossa, the knights were infidel thieves. For Suleiman the Magnificent, the continued presence of the Knights of St. John on Rhodes, a mere 18 kilometers, just over 11 miles, off the coast of his Anatolian heartland, was an intolerable insult. In 1522, he descended upon the island with an enormous invasion force of hundreds of ships and an army of over 100,000 men. The 7,000 knights and their mercenaries resisted with incredible valor for 6 long months, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. Finally, on terms of an honorable surrender, the surviving knights were allowed to leave Rhodes with their arms and their ships. For 7 years, they were homeless wanderers, until in 1530, the Habsburg Emperor Charles V granted them a new home, the barren, sun-scorched, and strategically vital archipelago of Malta. Malta was nothing like the lush, fertile island of Rhodes. It was a wind-swept rock with little soil and no natural sources of fresh water. But it possessed one of the finest natural harbors in the world, and it sat directly in the middle of the Mediterranean, a perfect choke point on the sea lanes between the eastern and western basins. The knights, under the leadership of their iron-willed Grand Master, Jean Parizeau de Valette, reluctantly accepted their new home and immediately set about turning it into the most advanced fortress complex the world had ever seen. From this new base, they resumed their corsairing activities with renewed vigor, once again becoming a major thorn in the side of the Ottoman Empire. The final straw for Suleiman came in 1564, when a Maltese galley captured a galleon belonging to the chief black eunuch of the Sultan's harem, seizing a vast fortune and several high-ranking women. Enraged, the aging Sultan resolved to wipe the Order of St. John from the face of the earth. In May of 1565, one of the largest armadas of the 16th century appeared off the coast of Malta. It consisted of nearly 200 ships carrying an elite invasion force of over 40,000 men, including the Janissaries, the Sultan's invincible household troops. To defend the island, Grand Master de Valette had fewer than 9,000 soldiers, most of whom were hastily raised Maltese militia. The stage was set for one of the most brutal and epic sieges in history. The Ottoman commanders first focused their immense artillery on the small, star-shaped Fort St. Elmo, which guarded the entrance to the Grand Harbor. They calculated it would fall in 3 days. The fort's small garrison held out for 31. The fighting was savage, a relentless inferno of cannon fire, musket shot, and Greek fire. The days were scorching, with summer temperatures regularly exceeding 38 degrees Celsius, over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The knights and their soldiers fought to the last man. When the fort finally fell, the Ottoman commander, enraged at the cost of his victory, had the bodies of the captured knights decapitated, their corpses nailed to crosses, and floated across the harbor to the main Christian positions. Valette, in a grim riposte, ordered all of his Ottoman prisoners to be beheaded, and their heads were fired from his largest cannons back into the Turkish camp. For 3 more months, the siege raged, a desperate battle of attrition around the main fortresses of Birgu and Senglea. The knights, led by the 70-year-old Valette, who fought on the ramparts alongside his men, repelled assault after assault, their courage seemingly unbreakable. Finally, in September, with his army decimated by casualties and ravaged by disease, the Ottoman commander learned that a small Christian relief force from Sicily had finally landed on the other side of the island. Believing the relief force to be much larger than it was, he lost his nerve, abandoned the siege, and sailed for home. The Great Siege of Malta was over. A tiny garrison of Christian knights had defied and defeated the full might of the Ottoman Empire. The victory sent a shockwave of euphoria and relief across Europe. While it did not end the Corsair Wars, which would continue to plague the Mediterranean for another 2.5 centuries, it marked a crucial turning point, shattering the aura of Ottoman invincibility at sea. The cycle of raid and counter-raid, of enslavement and ransom, would persist, a brutal economic and religious system that saw over 1 million Europeans carried off into slavery in North Africa, and countless Muslims chained to the oars of Christian galleys, until the rise of powerful new ocean-going navies from nations like Britain, the Netherlands, and a newly independent United States of America finally brought the age of the Corsairs to a violent and definitive close in the early 19th century. While the Mediterranean burned with the holy war of corsairs and knights, a very different, yet equally ferocious, brand of piracy was flourishing on the other side of the world. The vast maritime expanse of East and Southeast Asia, a vibrant tapestry of ancient empires, bustling trade routes, and countless islands, had for centuries been a pirate's hunting ground. Here, piracy was not a new phenomenon, but a deeply ingrained aspect of the maritime culture, an ever-present danger that ebbed and flowed with the tides of imperial power and economic desperation. From the chilly waters of Korea to the steamy, mangrove-choked estuaries of the Sulu archipelago, the raiders of the East operated on a scale that often dwarfed their European counterparts, creating sophisticated and powerful organizations that could not only challenge merchants, but could wage war against empires themselves. One of the most persistent and feared of these groups were the woku, a term of contempt meaning dwarf pirates, who for centuries terrorized the coastlines of China and Korea. Though the name was a pejorative reference to their presumed Japanese origin, the woku were, in reality, a complex and multinational coalition. Their ranks included not only Japanese ronin, masterless samurai cast adrift by the incessant civil wars of feudal Japan, but also disenfranchised Chinese fishermen, merchants who turned to smuggling to circumvent imperial trade bans, and even Portuguese adventurers who had recently arrived in Asian waters. The woku phenomenon surged in two great waves, the first in the 14th century, and the second, more devastating, wave in the 16th century. The catalyst for this second coming was the Ming dynasty's rigid and ultimately self-defeating maritime policy, the Haijin, or sea ban. In an attempt to control foreign influence, stamp out smuggling, and starve the pirates of their economic base, the Ming emperors had forbidden private sea trade, ordering coastal populations to move inland and restricting all commerce to a handful of officially sanctioned tribute missions. This draconian policy, instead of eliminating the problem, created a massive black market and drove countless coastal communities whose livelihoods had depended on the sea for generations into the arms of the woku. Men who were once legitimate traders were now branded as smugglers and pirates, with no choice but to operate outside the law. The woku of the 16th century were a far cry from the disorganized raiders of the past. They operated in large, well-armed fleets, sometimes numbering hundreds of vessels, known as junks, highly maneuverable ships with distinctive battened sails that allowed them to sail efficiently into the wind. They established fortified bases on islands off the Chinese coast, such as the Zhoushan archipelago, from which they could launch large-scale amphibious assaults. Their raids were not simple smash-and-grab affairs. They were carefully planned military operations. They would storm a shore, overwhelm local defenses, and plunder coastal cities for grain, silk, porcelain, and silver. More than just plunder, they were the armed enforcers of a vast smuggling network that defied the emperor's will, trading illicit goods between China, Japan, and Southeast Asia. The Ming Imperial Navy, despite its immense size on paper, was often riddled with corruption and inefficiency. Its ships were poorly maintained, and its crews were often demoralized and underpaid. For decades, the woku operated with near impunity, their raids growing ever bolder. The crisis reached its zenith in the 1550s, when they sacked major cities along the prosperous southern coast, even threatening the great metropolis of Nanjing. The court in Beijing was finally shocked into action, appointing a series of brilliant and ruthless military commanders to deal with the menace. The most famous of these was Qi Jiguang, a military genius who recognized that the imperial army's conventional tactics were ineffective against the Woku's agile, guerrilla-style warfare. The pirates often fought in small, disciplined units, with Japanese ronin forming a deadly vanguard, wielding their razor-sharp two-handed katanas with terrifying skill. In response, Qi developed a revolutionary new tactical system called the Mandarin Duck Formation. This was a small, combined arms squad of 12 men, each with a specialized role. Long spearmen would keep the katana-wielding pirates at bay, while soldiers, armed with a variety of polearms, tridents, and swords, would protect the spearmen and attack the enemy's flanks. 2 men at the rear operated firearms, providing covering fire. It was a perfectly synchronized unit designed to counter the specific strengths of the Woku. By combining these innovative tactics with a renewed and vigorous naval campaign, Qi Jiguang and his fellow commanders were able to systematically hunt down the pirate leaders and break the back of the Woku Confederation, finally restoring a semblance of imperial control over the Chinese coast by the late 1560s. Further south, in the warm, turquoise waters of the Malay archipelago, a different and even more terrifying form of piracy was practiced, one that centered not on smuggled goods, but on the systematic harvesting of human beings. This was the domain of the Iranun and Balangwingwi peoples, the so-called pirates of the Sulu Sea. Operating from the Sulu archipelago in the southern Philippines, these seafaring communities had for centuries practiced a form of maritime raiding that was central to their entire social and political structure. It was not an act of desperation, but a noble profession, a way of life that brought honor, wealth, and power. Their primary targets were the coastal villages of the Philippines, Borneo, and the Malay Peninsula. They sailed in magnificent and deadly vessels called lanong and garai. The lanong was a large, 2-masted raiding vessel, a floating fortress that could be over 30 meters, or nearly 100 feet, long and carry over 150 warriors. It was armed with heavy brass cannons, known as layla, and propelled by several tiers of oarsmen, making it swift and formidable in battle. The smaller, faster garay was an outrigger vessel, designed for speed and maneuverability, perfect for chasing down fleeing victims and navigating shallow waters. The raiding season was dictated by the monsoons. After the harvest, great fleets, sometimes comprising over 100 ships and thousands of warriors, would set out on their seasonal expeditions, known as Pangangayao. They would sweep through the archipelago, their arrival signaled by the ominous beating of gongs and the chilling shriek of war cries. They would descend upon villages, burning homes, slaughtering those who resisted, and capturing the rest. The men were often put to death, while women and children were prized captives, shackled and herded onto the raiding ships. This was slave raiding on an industrial scale. The captives were taken back to the Sulu Sultanate, which became the nexus of a vast slave trading network that fed the demand for labor in the Dutch East Indies, the Malay kingdoms, and even as far as China. Slaves toiled on pearl diving boats, in the salt mines, and on the spice plantations that produced the incredible wealth of the region. This was not a fringe activity. It was the engine of the Sulu economy. For the Spanish, who had colonized the northern Philippines, the Sulu slave raiders, whom they called the Moros, or Moors, were a mortal enemy. For 300 years, the Spanish waged a series of campaigns to subdue the Sulu Sultanate, but their heavy, deep-draft galleons were often outmaneuvered by the swift, shallow-draft prahus of the pirates in the intricate coastal waters. The Moro raids continued unabated, a constant terror that depopulated entire coastlines and instilled a deep and lasting fear throughout the Philippines. A fear that was only finally tamed in the mid-19th century with the arrival of a new and decisive technology, the steam-powered gunboat, whose machine-like speed and predictability finally overcame the monsoon wind-driven mastery of the Sulu sea raiders. Yet even the vast confederations of the Woku and the slave fleets of the Sulu Sea paled in comparison to the pirate armada that rose to power in Ming Dynasty China during the transitional period to the Qing Dynasty in the mid-17th century. This was the fleet of Zheng Yi, and more famously, his wife and successor, Qing Shi. Zheng Yi was a skilled and ambitious pirate who managed to do what no one before him had. He united the fractious, competing Cantonese pirate fleets under a single banner. He created a massive confederation with a strict code of laws, a formal governmental structure, and a clear division of resources. Upon his untimely death in a typhoon in 1807, command of this colossal pirate empire did not fall to one of his male lieutenants, but to his formidable widow, Qing Shi. Qing Shi, a former prostitute who had married into the pirate life, was a woman of extraordinary intelligence, political acumen, and ruthless ambition. She not only took command of her late husband's fleet, but solidified and expanded its power. At its height, her pirate confederation was a maritime state unto itself. She commanded the Red Flag Fleet, an armada that consisted of over 1,800 ships and employed more than 70,000 pirates, men, women, and even children. This was a force larger and more powerful than many national navies of the time. Her ships ranged from small, swift raiding vessels to massive ocean-going junks armed with dozens of cannons, many of them purchased from corrupt European traders or salvaged from captured Western ships. Under Qing Shi's command, the Confederation was not a chaotic mob, but a highly disciplined organization. She instituted a rigid code of laws that was brutally enforced. All plunder had to be presented to a common treasury and was then redistributed according to a strict formula, with the ship's captain receiving a large share and the rest divided among the crew. Any pirate found to have withheld loot was executed. Desertion was punished by having the offender's ears cut off. Rape of a female captive was an automatic death sentence. If a pirate wished to take a female captive as his wife, he was required to be faithful to her. Adultery was also punishable by death. This strict discipline transformed the pirates from a rabble of thugs into a cohesive and effective fighting force. Qing Shi's empire was financed through a massive protection racket that operated along the entire coast of Guangdong province. Towns, villages, and even major trading ports paid tribute to the Red Flag Fleet in exchange for being left alone. Merchant ships carrying salt, rice, and other goods were given a special flag, a safe conduct pass, that allowed them to travel unmolested after paying their fees. Those who refused to pay were attacked and destroyed without mercy. She effectively controlled the entire coastal economy of southern China, levying taxes and regulating trade with an authority that rivaled that of the emperor. The Qing government, already weakened by internal rebellion, was powerless to stop her. They sent fleet after fleet to destroy the pirates, and time after time, Qing Shi's forces outmaneuvered, outfought, and annihilated the Imperial Navy. They even defeated a combined fleet of Chinese, Portuguese, and British ships sent to destroy them. Having defeated every military attempt to crush her, and recognizing that a pirate's life was inherently unstable, Qing Shi made a calculated decision to negotiate her own surrender. In 1810, at the absolute zenith of her power, she sailed her entire undefeated fleet into Canton and negotiated a deal with the Governor-General. In an unprecedented move, she secured a universal amnesty for all of her followers. Not only were they all pardoned, but her pirates were allowed to keep their ill-gotten plunder, and many were even absorbed into the Qing military. Qing Shi herself, the most successful pirate in history, retired with her vast fortune, married her adopted son and second in command, Cheung Po Tsai, and lived out the rest of her life as a respectable citizen, dying of old age in 1844. Her story stands as a testament to the sheer scale and organizational complexity that the pirates of the East were capable of achieving, creating maritime empires that could challenge the authority of the Son of Heaven himself. As the great pirate empires of the East rose and fell, their junks and prahus writing a history of blood and silver in the Asian seas, the globe was being fundamentally and irrevocably reshaped by a new age of discovery. On the far side of the planet, across the vast, uncharted expanse of the Pacific, lay a world a hemisphere away, a new world that had become the personal treasure chest of the Spanish Empire. Here, in the brilliant turquoise waters of the Caribbean, a new and iconic chapter in the story of piracy was about to be written, not by state builders or religious warriors, but by a ragged and vengeful brotherhood of outcasts forged in the wild frontiers of a contested paradise. The Caribbean of the 16th and 17th centuries was a cauldron of imperial ambition. By the decree of the Pope in the Treaty of Tordesillas, the entire region, along with the vast continents it touched, was the exclusive property of Spain. From the silver-veined mountains of Peru and Mexico, a river of wealth, almost beyond comprehension, flowed into Spanish coffers. This treasure was transported on a fleet of heavily armed galleons, the legendary flota, which assembled annually to carry the riches of an empire back to Cadiz. It was the greatest and most concentrated movement of wealth the world had ever seen, and it made Spain the superpower of its age. But this monopoly bred a deep and bitter resentment among Spain's European rivals, England, France, and the Netherlands. Shut out of this incredible wealth by papal decree, they refused to recognize Spain's claim, viewing the Caribbean as an open opportunity for trade, settlement, and, most eagerly, for plunder. The Spanish Main, the coastline of the Spanish-American Empire, became a liquid battleground, and into this crucible of conflict stepped a new kind of man, a figure who would become the forefather of the Caribbean pirate, the Buccaneer. His story did not begin on the deck of a ship, but in the untamed wilderness of a single island. Hispaniola, the island that today houses Haiti and the Dominican Republic, was the first major Spanish colony in the Americas. But the Spanish had largely abandoned its western and northern coasts, focusing their efforts on more profitable territories. In their absence, nature had reclaimed the land with astonishing vigor. The cattle, pigs, and dogs brought by the early colonists had escaped into the wild, breeding over the decades into enormous feral herds that roamed the island's vast plains and jungles. This untamed paradise attracted a strange and lawless international community of castaways, deserters, escaped indentured servants, and adventurers, primarily from France. They were hunters, and they survived by stalking the wild cattle and boar. They learned from the native Taino people the art of curing the meat on a wooden frame over a slow fire. The frame was called a boucan, and the process Buccaneers. These men of the wilderness became known as the Buccaneers. They were a rugged, savage fraternity, living a life of brutal hardship and absolute freedom. Dressed in clothes stiffened with the dried blood of their prey, armed with long-barreled, lethally accurate muskets, and living in rough hunting camps, they owed allegiance to no king and followed no law but their own. But their very existence was an affront to Spain. To the Spanish crown, these men were illegal trespassers on royal land, poaching royal cattle. Determined to eradicate this foreign presence, Spanish authorities launched a series of brutal raids, sending hunting parties called lanceros to slaughter the Buccaneers and, more effectively, to destroy their livelihood by poisoning water holes and embarking on a massive, island-wide extermination of the feral herds. The Spanish policy was a catastrophic success. They destroyed the Buccaneers' way of life, but in doing so, they did not eliminate the men. They transformed them. Robbed of their livelihood on the land, their hearts filled with a burning hatred for the Spanish, the Buccaneers took to the sea. The hunter of beasts became a hunter of men. Their first sanctuary was a small, turtle-shaped island just off the northwest coast of Hispaniola called Tortuga. Its rocky coastline and natural harbors made it a perfect, easily defended fortress. From here, the Brethren of the Coast, as they called themselves, launched a private war of vengeance against all things Spanish. They were a uniquely democratic and egalitarian society, bound by a code of conduct they called the Custom of the Coast, or the Articles of Agreement. Before each voyage, the crew would agree on the rules: the captain's authority, the shares of plunder for each man, and compensation for injuries, a set amount of silver for the loss of an eye, an arm, or a leg. The captain was elected and could be deposed by a majority vote of the crew. All decisions were made together, and all loot was divided with a fairness unthinkable in the rigidly hierarchical navies of Europe. These men, skilled marksmen from their hunting days, began their new careers in small, stolen canoes or longboats called periaguas. They would lie in wait in shallow channels, their small vessels hidden from view, and attack unwary Spanish merchant ships with terrifying ferocity. A single volley from their muskets could wipe out the officers and helmsmen on the deck of a Spanish vessel, after which they would swarm aboard, their faces blackened with gunpowder, brandishing cutlasses and axes. Their reputation for cruelty became legendary, a terror born of revenge. None was more feared than the Frenchman Jean-David Naud, better known as François l'Olonnais, a former indentured servant whose hatred for the Spanish bordered on psychopathy. L'Olonnais was infamous for torturing his Spanish prisoners, and it was said he once ripped out the heart of a captive and gnawed on it to terrify the man's comrades into revealing a hidden root. The Buccaneers cultivated this image of monstrous cruelty, as fear was their most effective weapon. As their success grew, the buccaneering enterprise became more organized and attracted the attention of Spain's enemies. In 1655, an English expedition sent by Oliver Cromwell seized the island of Jamaica from the Spanish. Poorly defended and lacking in profitable plantations, the English governor made a pragmatic and fateful decision. He invited the Brethren of the Coast to use the magnificent natural harbor of Port Royal as their new base of operations. The English crown began issuing letters of marque, official documents that turned these pirates into privateers, giving them a thin veneer of legality. They were now licensed to attack Spanish ships and colonies, all in the name of the King of England. Port Royal was transformed almost overnight from a sleepy backwater into the richest and most wicked city in the Christendom. It was the Buccaneer capital, a Sodom of the New World, where the vast plunder of the Spanish Empire was liquidated into rum, dice, and debauchery. At its height, 1 in every 4 buildings was a tavern or a brothel. Silks and jewels, looted from Spanish churches, adorned the local prostitutes, and the taverns overflowed with pirates drinking wine from silver chalices. The city sat at the mouth of a harbor that could shelter 500 ships, and its warehouses groaned with the captured goods of an empire. It was from this den of glorious iniquity that the greatest of all buccaneers would emerge, Henry Morgan. A Welshman of obscure origins, Morgan possessed a rare combination of tactical brilliance, ruthless ambition, and immense charisma. He was not merely a captain, but a natural leader who could unite thousands of the most unruly and dangerous men on earth into a disciplined and effective army. Operating with the tacit approval of the Jamaican governor, Morgan elevated buccaneering from opportunistic raids to full-scale military campaigns. In 1668, he achieved the unthinkable by capturing the heavily fortified city of Portobello on the coast of Panama, one of the 3 most important Spanish treasure ports. His men scaled the walls of its fortresses in a daring night attack, using captured priests and nuns as human shields against the Spanish defenders. After sacking the city and torturing its leading citizens for their hidden wealth, he ransomed it back to the Spanish governor for a fortune. He followed this with an equally audacious raid on the wealthy coastal cities of Maracaibo and Gibraltar in modern-day Venezuela, again escaping a powerful Spanish fleet sent to trap him through a cunning and audacious use of a fire ship. But his ultimate ambition, his masterpiece of plunder, was yet to come: the sack of Panama City itself, the jewel of the Spanish Pacific, a city so wealthy it was known as the Cup of Gold. In 1670, Morgan assembled the largest buccaneer fleet ever seen, over 36 ships and nearly 2,000 men. His target, Panama, was on the far side of the American continent, accessible only by a long and treacherous march across the isthmus. After capturing the fortress at the mouth of the Chagres River, Morgan and his men began their overland journey. It was a descent into a green hell. For 9 days, they hacked their way through suffocating jungle, a grueling trek of nearly 80 kilometers, or 50 miles. The Spanish had employed a scorched earth policy, and the Buccaneers, their own provisions exhausted, were pushed to the brink of starvation, forced to eat leather bags and their own belts to survive. Finally, emaciated but resolute, they emerged from the jungle to see the savannas stretching before them, and, in the distance, the shimmering towers of Panama. The Spanish had assembled a force of regular infantry and cavalry to meet them on the plain before the city. It was a formal European battle, the kind the Buccaneers should not have been able to win. But the Spanish cavalry, charging across the soft, boggy ground, was decimated by the coordinated and lethally accurate volleys of the Buccaneers' muskets. The Spanish infantry broke, the army was routed, and the city was theirs. The sack that followed was an orgy of destruction and cruelty that lasted for weeks. The city was burned to the ground, and its citizens were systematically tortured on the rack to reveal their hidden fortunes. When Morgan finally led his men back across the isthmus, they carried a train of nearly 200 mules laden with gold, silver, and jewels. It was the greatest buccaneer raid in history. But by the time Morgan returned to Port Royal, the political landscape had changed. England and Spain had signed a peace treaty. Morgan's raid, a stunning military success, was now a profound political embarrassment. He was arrested and sent back to England in chains to face justice. Yet in the cynical world of imperial politics, his success was too great to punish. Instead of being executed as a pirate, he was hailed as a national hero, knighted by King Charles II and sent back to Jamaica as its lieutenant governor. Sir Henry Morgan, the pirate king, had become the establishment. His story marked the zenith and the end of the buccaneering era. With peace declared, the letters of marque were revoked. The licensed privateers who had fought a proxy war for England were now a liability. Thousands of skilled, violent, and unemployed sailors were suddenly adrift in the Caribbean, men who knew no other trade than taking prizes at sea. They had been the tools of empires, but with their state-sanctioned purpose gone, they would not simply fade away. They would raise a new flag, a black one, and declare war not just on Spain, but on the entire world. The Golden Age of Piracy was about to dawn. The Buccaneers had been the brutal, state-sanctioned sledgehammer that England used to shatter the foundations of Spanish power in the New World. But the tool had become too dangerous, too independent. And by the turn of the 18th century, the empires of Europe sought to bring a semblance of order to their colonial frontiers. The long and bloody War of the Spanish Succession, a global conflict that had provided plentiful employment for privateers, finally came to an end in 1713 with the Treaty of Utrecht. Almost overnight, the privateering commissions that had given a thin veil of legality to the plundering of enemy ships were revoked. Thousands of seasoned, battle-hardened sailors, men who had known nothing but war and prize-taking for over a decade, were unceremoniously discharged in port cities from Bristol to Boston. They were skilled mariners and gunners, yet they were now unemployed, destitute, and deeply resentful of the very governments that had used and discarded them. They had tasted a life of freedom and fortune at sea, and were loath to return to the crushing discipline and miserable pay of the Royal Navy or the merchant service. This vast, volatile population of idle seamen was a powder keg waiting for a spark. And in the summer of 1715, a hurricane of almost unimaginable force provided it. A magnificent Spanish treasure fleet, the flota, laden with the accumulated wealth of a year's mining in Mexico and Peru. Gold doubloons, silver bars, and precious jewels, was caught by the storm just off the coast of Florida. 11 of its 12 ships were smashed to pieces on the reefs, scattering a king's ransom across the seabed and onto the beaches for a stretch of over 50 kilometers, more than 30 miles. The Spanish authorities established a salvage camp to recover the immense treasure, but news of the wreck spread like wildfire through the taverns and seaports of the Caribbean. For the unemployed privateers, it was a call to arms, a siren song of unimaginable riches for the taking. The first to answer was an English captain named Henry Jennings, who led a fleet of ships from Jamaica to the Florida coast. He and his men didn't dive for the sunken treasure. They stormed the poorly defended Spanish camp, overwhelming the soldiers and making off with over 350,000 pieces of 8, a massive haul of silver weighing several tons. This single, audacious act of piracy, a direct attack on the property of a supposedly friendly nation, was the true beginning of the new era. Jennings and his fellow raiders needed a place to sell their loot and refit their ships, a base of operations beyond the reach of royal governors and naval patrols. They found it in the Bahamas, on a small, strategically perfect island called New Providence. The main settlement on New Providence, a derelict English colony named Nassau, was a ghost town with a magnificent harbor. Crucially, the harbor had 2 entrances, one deep and one shallow, and was protected by a sandbar that made it inaccessible to the heavy, deep-draft warships of the Royal Navy. It was a perfect pirate sanctuary. Under the leadership of veteran privateers like Benjamin Hornigold and his ambitious protege, Edward Teach, the men who had plundered the Florida wreck established a pirate haven in Nassau. They called themselves the Flying Gang, and they declared war on all nations. Nassau was transformed into a pirate republic, a true outlaw state that operated on its own terms. Thousands of sailors flocked to join the brethren, swelling their numbers until they commanded a fleet that could rival any navy in the Americas. It was a wild, debauched, and uniquely democratic society. The pirate captains were elected by their crews. All major decisions were put to a vote, and the plunder was divided according to a strict, pre-arranged code. There was even a form of social insurance, with set payments awarded for injuries sustained in battle. In a world defined by the tyranny of kings, naval officers, and merchant captains, the Black Flag offered a life of radical equality and the promise of spectacular wealth. For a brief, brilliant period of about 10 years, this Republic of Rogues held the Caribbean in a chokehold, and from its anarchic shores, the most legendary names in the history of piracy would sail into infamy. No name is more synonymous with the Golden Age than that of Blackbeard. The man who began his career as Edward Teach under Benjamin Hornigold was a master of image and psychological warfare. He was a towering figure, but his most potent weapon was his appearance. He cultivated a terrifying persona, a sea devil designed to make his enemies surrender without a fight. He wore his thick black beard long and plaited into pigtails, which he would tie with ribbons. Before a battle, he would tuck slow-burning hemp fuses, soaked in saltpeter and lime water, under the brim of his hat and into his beard. wreathed in a cloud of thick, acrid smoke, with his eyes glaring like coals in the gloom. He appeared to his victims as a demon emerging from the depths of hell. He wore a crimson coat and a sling over his shoulders that held not one, but 3 pairs of loaded flintlock pistols, ready for immediate use. His flag was not the simple skull and crossbones, but a skeleton holding a spear, jabbing at a bleeding heart, while toasting the devil with a wine glass. The message was unmistakable: surrender or face a merciless death. Blackbeard's tactics were as audacious as his appearance. In early 1717, he captured a massive French slaving vessel, the Concorde, off the island of St. Vincent. He refitted the ship, mounting 40 cannons on its decks, and renamed it the Queen Anne's Revenge. In this floating fortress, he was the master of the American seaboard. In May of 1718, he committed his most brazen act, sailing the Queen Anne's Revenge and his flotilla to the mouth of the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, one of the busiest ports in the British colonies. He blockaded the entire port, capturing every ship that tried to enter or leave. He was not after gold, but medicine. His crew was suffering from venereal disease, and he sent a delegation of pirates ashore with a demand for the city's council: a chest of medical supplies, or he would execute all of his high-profile prisoners and burn the captured ships. For nearly a week, the city was held hostage by a single pirate captain. Finally, his demands were met, and Blackbeard, true to his word, released the prisoners and sailed away, leaving a stunned and humiliated colony in his wake. While Blackbeard built his legend on terror, another captain, Samuel Bellamy, styled himself as a revolutionary hero. Known as Black Sam Bellamy, he saw himself not as a common thief, but as a righteous crusader against the corruption and hypocrisy of the wealthy elite. His career was short, but spectacularly successful. In just over a year, he and his crew captured more than 50 ships. In early 1717, he captured a state-of-the-art, brand-new slave ship called the Whydah Galley. It was on its maiden voyage, returning from the triangular trade route, laden with the immense profits from the sale of its human cargo in Jamaica: gold, indigo, and over 400,000 pieces of eight. The Whydah was one of the greatest pirate prizes of all time, carrying over 4.5 tons, or more than 4,000 kilograms, of gold and silver. Bellamy's philosophy was perfectly captured in a famous exchange with a Captain Beer, whose merchant ship he had just captured. When Beer declined an invitation to join the pirates, Bellamy unleashed a torrent of scorn that perfectly encapsulated the pirate creed. "I am a free prince, and I have as much authority to make war on the whole world as he who has 100 sail of ships at sea," he declared, scorning the kings and rulers who rob the poor under the cover of law, while condemning the pirates for doing the same. He railed against the cowardice of merchant captains who served wealthy owners who would not risk their own lives, calling them a sneaking puppy. It was a declaration of class warfare on the high seas. Bellamy, the self-proclaimed prince of pirates, did not enjoy his fortune for long. Just a few months after capturing the Whydah, in April 1717, his fleet was caught in a furious nor'easter off the coast of Cape Cod. The mighty Whydah galley, heavy with treasure, was driven onto a sandbar and capsized, breaking apart in the violent surf and taking Bellamy and all but 2 of his 146-man crew to the bottom of the sea. The Pirate Republic was also a place where the rigid gender roles of the 18th century could, on rare occasion, be shattered. The flamboyant, but largely ineffectual, Captain John Rackham, known as Calico Jack, for his love of brightly colored calico clothing, would be a minor footnote in pirate history were it not for 2 of his crew members, Anne Bonny and Mary Read. Anne was the illegitimate daughter of a wealthy Irish lawyer and his maid. She had a notoriously fiery temper and had eloped to Nassau with a small-time pirate named James Bonny. There, she grew tired of her husband and fell for the charismatic Calico Jack. She left her husband, disguised herself as a man, and joined Rackham's crew aboard his ship, the Revenge. She proved to be a formidable pirate, as skilled with a pistol and cutlass as any man aboard. The crew accepted her, and she fought openly as a woman alongside them. Their story took an even more improbable turn when they captured a small merchant ship. A young sailor from the captured vessel agreed to join Rackham's crew. This young sailor, who went by the name Mark Reed, was exceptionally skilled in combat. Anne Bonny found herself drawn to the handsome young sailor and began to spend a great deal of time with him, sparking the jealous rage of Calico Jack. Rackham threatened to slit the young sailor's throat, at which point Anne revealed her secret to him. To save Mark's life, she let him know she was a woman. The young sailor then confided in Anne, taking her aside and baring his chest to reveal that he was also a woman. Mary Read had spent most of her life disguised as a man, a ruse started by her mother to secure an inheritance. She had served with distinction in the British Army in Flanders, proving herself a capable soldier. Now, 2 of the most dangerous pirates in Calico Jack's crew were women, living and fighting as equals among the men. Their secret was eventually revealed to the whole crew. But by then, they had earned so much respect for their courage and fighting prowess that no one dared challenge them. Their careers came to an abrupt end in October 1720, when their ship was ambushed by pirate hunters led by Captain Jonathan Barnett. According to legend, Calico Jack and most of the male crew were blind drunk after a party and put up little resistance. The only two who fought to defend the ship were Anne Bonny and Mary Read, who raged at the men to come out and fight like men. They were all captured and put on trial in Jamaica. Calico Jack and the male pirates were swiftly sentenced to hang. Anne Bonny's last words to her lover were scathing. "Had you fought like a man, you need not have been hanged like a dog." Both Anne and Mary escaped immediate execution by revealing that they were pregnant, pleading their bellies, a legal stay of execution. Mary Read died in prison a short time later from a violent fever. The fate of Anne Bonny is unknown. She vanishes from the historical record, leaving behind only the incredible tale of her life as one of the few female pirates to carve her own legend in a world of men. The Golden Age was a brief, blazing fire of rebellion, but the empires it defied were beginning to gather their strength. They would not tolerate a republic of rogues on their doorstep for long. A new kind of hunter was coming to the Caribbean, a man with a royal mandate to exterminate the pirates and restore imperial order by any means necessary. The brazen exploits of Blackbeard, the revolutionary rhetoric of Sam Bellamy, and the anarchic freedom of the pirate republic in Nassau had become more than a mere nuisance to the British Empire. They were a direct and humiliating challenge to its imperial authority, and more critically, to its immense commercial interests. The fortunes of the empire were built upon the triangular trade, a vast and brutally efficient system that connected the factories of Britain, the slave markets of West Africa, and the sugar and tobacco plantations of the Americas. This intricate web of global commerce, which generated obscene profits for merchants, bankers, and the crown itself, was being systematically strangled by the pirates of the flying gang. Merchant captains wrote frantic letters to London, detailing how their ships were being plundered at an alarming rate. Insurance rates for voyages to the colonies skyrocketed, and the very governors of the American colonies pleaded for naval assistance against a foe that seemed to strike with impunity. The British government, finally galvanized into action, decided that the pirate menace had to be eradicated, not just contained. Their response was a classic imperial strategy, a two-pronged attack that combined the velvet glove of amnesty with the iron fist of overwhelming merciless force. The man chosen to deliver this ultimatum was Captain Woodes Rogers, a figure who knew the world of privateering and piracy better than almost anyone. Rogers was a celebrated national hero, a renowned privateer from the War of the Spanish Succession, who had led a circumnavigation of the globe, during which he had rescued the castaway Alexander Selkirk from a deserted island, an ordeal that would later inspire Daniel Defoe's novel, Robinson Crusoe. Rogers was no stranger to the motivations and mindset of the men who sailed under the black flag. But he was also a shrewd businessman with deep investments in the slave trade and a staunch believer in the necessity of imperial order. In 1717, King George I issued a royal proclamation, the Act of Grace, which offered a full pardon to any pirate who surrendered to a British governor by a set deadline. It was an offer of clemency, a chance for the outlaws to return to the fold without facing the hangman's noose. But it came with an implicit and deadly threat. For those who refused the king's pardon, there would be no mercy. Woodes Rogers was appointed the new royal governor of the Bahamas, and with a small fleet of Royal Navy warships, he set sail for Nassau, the very heart of the pirate republic, with the express mission to restore law and order. Rogers' arrival in Nassau in July 1718 signaled the beginning of the end for the Republic of Rogues. The sight of his warships at the mouth of the harbor sent a shockwave of panic and division through the pirate community. Many, seeing the futility of resistance, were eager to accept the pardon. Men who had once been leading figures of the Flying Gang, including its founder, Benjamin Hornigold, quickly switched their allegiance, accepting the king's grace and offering their services to the new governor as pirate hunters. They knew the islands, the ships, and the tactics of their former comrades better than any naval officer. But a significant faction of pirates, the diehards, refused to bow to any king. Their leader was Charles Vane, a pirate of singular ferocity and unwavering commitment to the cause. Vane was a true ideologue, a man who would rather die under his own black flag than live under the royal one. As Rogers's fleet moved to blockade the harbor, Vane orchestrated a spectacular and defiant escape. He took a captured French prize ship, loaded it with explosives and flammable materials, and set it ablaze, sending the blazing fire ship careening directly towards the Royal Navy vessels. In the ensuing chaos and confusion, as the naval ships scrambled to avoid the inferno, Vane and his crew slipped out of the harbor's narrow secondary entrance in a small, swift sloop and escaped into the open sea, firing a cannon in a final gesture of contempt for the new governor. Vane's escape was a dramatic flourish, but it was a fleeting victory. The tide had irrevocably turned. Rogers took control of Nassau, established a council, and began the arduous process of transforming the pirate den into a respectable British colony. He put the pardoned pirates to work rebuilding the fort and used his new recruits, Hornigold among them, to hunt down those who had refused the pardon. The Royal Navy, once a rare sight in the backwaters of the Caribbean, now began a relentless and systematic campaign to hunt down the remaining pirate crews. They patrolled the sea lanes, blockaded pirate-friendly coves, and worked in concert with colonial governors who were now empowered and equipped to fight back. The case of Stede Bonnet, the so-called gentleman pirate, was a stark illustration of this new reality. Bonnet was a wealthy landowner from Barbados with no seafaring experience who, in a fit of what was likely a midlife crisis, had abandoned his family, bought a sloop he named the Revenge, and turned to piracy. He had briefly sailed with Blackbeard, who had treated him with contempt, and had even accepted the pardon before lapsing back into his old ways. In the summer of 1718, Bonnet was cornered by a force of pirate hunters from South Carolina in the Cape Fear River. After a fierce battle, he and his crew were captured, taken to Charleston, the very city Blackbeard had humiliated, and put on trial. Despite his pleas for clemency and his high social standing, he was found guilty and hanged, his body left to rot in a gibbet at the harbor's entrance as a warning to all others. The most famous pirate of them all, Blackbeard, met his end in a similar fashion just a month later. The governor of Virginia, Alexander Spotswood, exasperated by Blackbeard's continued presence off his coast, organized a secret, quasi-legal expedition to hunt him down in his lair in Ocracoke Inlet, North Carolina. Led by Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy, 2 small sloops, their decks packed with hidden soldiers, trapped Blackbeard and his skeleton crew by surprise. The battle was a brutal, bloody melee fought on the decks of the ships. Blackbeard fought like a cornered lion, his towering figure a whirlwind of smoke and steel. According to Maynard's own account, the pirate captain suffered an incredible number of wounds, at least 5 pistol shots and over 20 severe sword cuts, before he finally fell dead on the deck. Maynard had his head severed from his body and hung it from the bowsprit of his sloop as a gruesome trophy and undeniable proof of his victory. The death of Blackbeard sent a powerful message. No pirate, no matter how feared or legendary, was beyond the reach of the Empire's vengeance. The final nail in the coffin of the Golden Age was a series of legal and institutional changes that made the business of piracy infinitely more dangerous. The British Parliament strengthened the laws, streamlining the process for trying and convicting pirates. Special vice admiralty courts were established in the colonies, allowing for swift trials without the need for a sympathetic local jury. The act of trading with pirates was made a capital offense, cutting off their access to supplies and markets. And perhaps most importantly, the use of public execution was turned into a powerful form of state theater. The hangings of captured pirates were highly ritualized public spectacles. Doomed men were paraded through the streets, subjected to fiery sermons from preachers, and allowed to give their last dying speeches from the gallows, speeches that were often printed and sold in pamphlets to a fascinated public. Their bodies were not cut down and buried, but often subjected to a post-mortem process called gibbeting. The corpse would be coated in tar as a preservative, placed inside a custom-made iron cage, and hung from a prominent location at the mouth of a harbor, where it would remain for years, a slowly desiccating, horrifying monument to the price of piracy. This relentless campaign of hunting, prosecution, and psychological warfare proved devastatingly effective. One by one, the great captains were killed or captured. Charles Vane, after his daring escape from Nassau, was eventually shipwrecked, captured, and hanged in Jamaica. The crew of Calico Jack Rackham, with Anne Bonny and Mary Read, was captured and met the same fate. Edward Lowe, a pirate infamous for his sadistic cruelty, who would burn his victims alive or slice off their ears and noses, simply vanished from the historical record, presumed to have met a violent end at the hands of either pirate hunters or his own mutinous crew. By 1726, less than a decade after Woodes Rogers had arrived in Nassau, the Golden Age was over. The pirate threat that had once brought the commerce of the Americas to its knees had been systematically and ruthlessly extinguished. The Jolly Roger, the potent symbol of defiance and rebellion, was all but wiped from the seas. The era of the great Caribbean pirates had passed into history, but it would not be forgotten. It would live on, not as a story of crime and punishment, but as a powerful and enduring legend of freedom, adventure, and rebellion against a world that was becoming increasingly ordered, controlled, and civilized. The empires had won, but the pirate, in death, would capture the world's imagination for centuries to come. The decisive campaigns of the Royal Navy and the unyielding justice of the Admiralty courts had effectively shattered the great pirate republics of the Golden Age, sweeping the iconic figures of the Caribbean from the world stage. For a time, it seemed as though the age of large-scale, organized piracy might be a closed chapter in the book of history, a romantic but finished tale. Yet the fundamental impulses that drive men to piracy, poverty, political instability, and the perennial lure of capturing wealth rather than creating it, did not vanish with the last gibbeted corpse in Port Royal. As the old European empires waned and the technologies of the Industrial Revolution began to reshape the world, the black flag would rise again, not in the familiar haunts of the Caribbean, but in new and unexpected waters. The pirates of the modern era would be a different breed. Their motives and methods forged in the crucible of post-colonial chaos and globalized trade, a stark and often brutal reflection of the inequalities of the modern world. The first and most dramatic resurgence exploded into the headlines in the early years of the 21st century, in one of the most strategically vital and notoriously lawless corners of the globe, the Horn of Africa. The waters of the Gulf of Aden, which connect the Red Sea to the Arabian Sea, form a critical maritime choke point. Through this narrow corridor, a significant percentage of the world's trade, particularly its oil, must pass, making the supertankers and massive container ships that transit its length the lifeblood of the global economy. And on its southern shore lay Somalia, a nation that had for decades been the very definition of a failed state. The collapse of its central government in 1991 had plunged the country into a maelstrom of civil war, famine, and warlordism, leaving its vast coastline, the longest in mainland Africa, at over 3,000 kilometers, nearly 2,000 miles, completely unpoliced. The origins of modern Somali piracy were not born of simple greed, but of desperation and a sense of profound grievance. In the absence of a functioning government or coast guard, the rich fishing grounds off the Somali coast became a free-for-all for international industrial fishing fleets. Huge, sophisticated trawlers from Europe and Asia swept through the waters, illegally and unsustainably hoovering up the fish stocks that local Somali fishermen had depended upon for generations. To make matters even worse, the ungoverned waters became a dumping ground for toxic and even nuclear waste from unscrupulous foreign companies, poisoning the marine ecosystem and further devastating local livelihoods. Faced with starvation and the destruction of their way of life, a group of these fishermen decided to fight back. They armed themselves, boarded their small fishing skiffs, and began to confront the illegal trawlers. They called themselves the Volunteer Coast Guard of Somalia, and their initial goal was to seize the foreign vessels and levy a fine against them for poaching in their waters. But these early acts of vigilante justice quickly revealed a far more lucrative opportunity. They discovered that the owners of these large commercial vessels were willing to pay substantial sums of money to have their ships and crews returned safely. What began as a desperate attempt to protect their fishing grounds morphed into a highly organized and immensely profitable criminal enterprise, modern maritime piracy. The Somali pirates were not the swashbuckling figures of legend. They were typically young men from impoverished coastal villages, armed not with cutlasses and flintlocks, but with rusty AK-47s, rocket-propelled grenades, RPGs, and GPS devices. Their vessels were not imposing galleons, but small, open-hulled fiberglass skiffs powered by powerful outboard motors. Their tactics were brutally effective. They would operate from a larger mother ship, often a captured fishing trawler, which allowed them to extend their reach far out into the Indian Ocean, hundreds of kilometers from shore. When a target was spotted, a slow-moving, low-sided bulk carrier or tanker, a team of skiffs would be launched in pursuit. Using their speed and agility, they would swarm the massive vessel, firing their automatic weapons at the bridge to intimidate the crew. Their primary tool was a long, lightweight ladder, often with a grappling hook at the end, which they would use to scale the sides of the ship. Once aboard, they would seize control, round up the crew, and force the captain to pilot the vessel to one of their coastal strongholds, pirate havens like Isle or Hobyo. Unlike the pirates of old, who were often interested in the cargo, the Somali business model was centered entirely on the crew. The ship and its contents were merely collateral. The real prize was the multinational crew, who became hostages in a high-stakes negotiation. The pirates would contact the ship's owner, a global shipping conglomerate based in London, Athens, or Tokyo, and demand a ransom, often starting in the millions of dollars. These negotiations could be protracted and agonizing, lasting for months. During this time, the hostage crews were kept under armed guard in terrifying and often squalid conditions. While the pirates were generally careful not to harm their valuable human assets, the psychological toll on the captives was immense. For the pirates, a successful hijacking could bring life-altering wealth. A single ransom payment, often airdropped onto the deck of the captured ship in a waterproof container, could amount to several million US. This money was then divided according to a sophisticated system. A large portion went to the pirate financiers, the local warlords and businessmen who provided the weapons, boats, and supplies for the operation. The rest was divided among the pirates who carried out the attack, with bonuses for the first man to board the ship, or for those who brought their own weapons. In the context of a country with a per capita income of only a few $100s a year, a single successful operation could make a young man fantastically rich, allowing him to build a new house, buy luxury cars, and become a powerful figure in his community. This influx of cash created pirate boomtowns along the coast. But it also fueled the local warlordy economy, perpetuating the very cycle of violence and lawlessness that had allowed piracy to flourish in the first place. At its peak, between 2008 and 2011, Somali piracy was a global crisis. Over 100 ships were being attacked each year, costing the global economy an estimated $7 billion annually in ransoms, increased insurance premiums, and the expense of rerouting ships around the entire continent of Africa. The world's navies were finally compelled to act. A massive international naval coalition involving warships from the European Union, the United States, China, Russia, India, and many other nations, was assembled to patrol the Gulf of Aden. This unprecedented naval task force created a protected transit corridor, escorted convoys of merchant ships, and actively hunted down pirate skiffs. Simultaneously, the shipping industry itself adapted. Vessels were hardened with physical defenses like razor wire and high-pressure fire hoses to prevent boarding. Many ships began carrying armed private security teams, whose presence proved to be a powerful deterrent. These measures, combined with efforts to build a more stable government ashore in Somalia, caused a dramatic decline in successful hijackings. By 2015, the Somali piracy epidemic had largely subsided, though the underlying conditions of poverty and instability remain a persistent threat. While the world was focused on the dramatic events off the Horn of Africa, a more traditional and arguably more violent form of piracy continued to thrive in another of the world's great maritime crossroads, the Strait of Malacca. This narrow, 800-kilometer-long or 500-mile-long stretch of water between Malaysia and the Indonesian island of Sumatra is the shortest sea route between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. Over a third of the world's shipping, including most of the oil destined for China and Japan, passes through its congested and island-studded waters. This immense volume of traffic, combined with a complex political geography involving multiple nations, has made the strait a pirate hotspot for centuries. Unlike the Somali model of kidnap for ransom, the pirates of the Strait of Malacca are more akin to maritime muggers and armed robbers. They are typically members of organized criminal syndicates, operating in small, high-speed boats. Their attacks are swift, brutal, and focused on theft. They often strike at night, using the cover of darkness to sneak up on vessels, particularly slow-moving tugboats, barges, and smaller tankers. Armed with machetes, knives, and guns, they swarm aboard, terrorize the crew, and quickly loot the ship's safe for cash, steal laptops, mobile phones, and any other valuables they can find. These hit-and-run attacks are usually over in less than 30 minutes, with the pirates melting back into the maze of nearby islands long before any law enforcement can respond. A more sophisticated and dangerous variation is the hijacking of entire vessels for their cargo. In these cases, highly organized criminal gangs will target small tankers carrying valuable refined oil products like diesel or marine fuel. The pirates, often working with inside information, will board the vessel, take the crew hostage, and sail it to a prearranged location where a second, phantom tanker is waiting. They will then pump the stolen cargo from one ship to the other in a ship-to-ship transfer on the open sea. Once the oil is siphoned off, the original crew and vessel are typically released, though the pirates have been known to murder the crew to eliminate witnesses. This form of piracy requires a high degree of coordination, technical skill, and a network to launder and sell the stolen multi-million-dollar cargo on the black market. Coordinated patrols by the navies of Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore have had some success in suppressing the problem, but the sheer volume of traffic and the complex geography of the region make it an enduring and persistent challenge, a modern-day echo of the age-old struggle to police the world's most vital commercial arteries. Our voyage through the shadowed history of piracy has now reached its final port of call. We have sailed from the dawn of maritime history to the turbulent waters of the present day, tracing the evolution of a figure who is at once a brutal criminal, a folk hero, a rebel, and a reflection of the ages. The story of the pirate is not one story, but many. A global epic written in blood and treasure on the vast blue canvas of the world's oceans. We began in the dying light of the Bronze Age, when the mysterious sea peoples emerged from the waves to bring mighty empires to their knees. We saw how the ancient Greeks viewed raiding as an honorable trade, and how a young Julius Caesar fell into the hands of Cilician sea lords who failed to recognize the world-conquering ambition burning behind his eyes. We felt the terror of the Viking longship, a dragon-proud vessel that carried fire and slaughter from the rivers of Russia to the shores of the New World. And we witnessed the centuries-long holy war fought between the Barbary Corsairs and the Knights of St. John, a savage, mirrored conflict of faith and enslavement in the contested waters of the Mediterranean. Our journey took us east to the great pirate confederacies of China and Japan, where figures like Qing Shi commanded fleets larger than many national navies, creating maritime empires that challenged the Son of Heaven himself. We tracked the birth of the Caribbean buccaneer on Hispaniola, a hunter of beasts forged into a hunter of men by imperial cruelty. And we watched his successor, the Golden Age pirate of Nassau, declare a brief, glorious, and doomed war on the entire world. Finally, we saw the black flag rise again in modern times, wielded by desperate Somali fishermen turned hijackers and ruthless criminal syndicates in the Strait of Malacca, proving that as long as there is wealth moving upon the water and lawlessness on the shore, piracy will endure. Throughout this long and bloody history, the pirate has always been a mirror, reflecting the world from which he emerges. He is a product of his time, a symptom of a larger disorder. Piracy flourishes in the vacuums of power, in the spaces between empires, and on the frontiers of law and civilization. When states collapse or fail to project their authority, the pirate becomes a king. When governments create oppressive monopolies or drive their people into poverty, the pirate becomes a rebel. When ideologies clash, he becomes a holy warrior. The men who sailed under the Jolly Roger during the Golden Age were not merely thieves. They were a direct response to the brutal tyrannies of the merchant marine and the Royal Navy, creating a radically democratic, egalitarian society that was a direct affront to the rigid hierarchies of the world they had left behind. The Somali fisherman who picks up an AK-47 is a criminal, but he is also a product of a failed state and the exploitation of his nation's resources by foreign powers. The story of piracy is the story of what happens when the systems of law, trade, and government break down. Yet, for all the brutal reality of their existence, a life that was almost always short, violent, and desperate, the figure of the pirate retains a powerful, almost romantic grip on our collective imagination. We are drawn to the idea of the outcast who rejects the world and its rules, the captain who is master of his own ship and his own destiny. It is the fantasy of a life unbound, a life of radical freedom lived just over the horizon. The Jolly Roger, in the end, was more than just a symbol of death. It was a declaration of independence from the known world, a commitment to a life outside the law, for better or much more often, for worse. And so the story of the pirate endures, not simply as a chronicle of crime, but as a testament to a defiant, brutal, and untamable human spirit, forever linked to the wildness of the sea itself.